The gold fever of California. The year was 1849, and the California gold rush was in full swing. The promise of wealth and a fresh start drew thousands of hopefuls from across the world, including a young German immigrant named Johann Müller. He had left his home in Bavaria with little more than a battered suitcase and a heart full of ambition. Stories of men striking it rich had reached Europe, and Johann was determined to claim his share of the fortune. The journey had been arduous. Months aboard a crowded ship brought him across the Atlantic to the bustling port of New York and then overland across harsh, unforgiving terrain. By the time Johann reached the dusty boomtown of San Francisco, he was down to his last few coins. The city was alive with the chaotic energy of prospectors, merchants, and opportunists, all chasing the same golden dream. Johann spent his first night sleeping on the floor of a noisy saloon, the air thick with the smell of whiskey and desperation. His only possession of value was a small, well-worn map given to him by a fellow traveler, a crude sketch of a promising claim near the American River. The next morning, Johann gathered what little he could afford: a shovel, a tin pan, and a sack of supplies. The shopkeeper, an older man with a knowing smile, handed him the items and said, "Good luck, boy. You'll need it." Johann made his way into the hills, the weight of his hopes pressing heavier with each step. The goldfields were nothing like he had imagined. Instead of a land of untold riches, he found a harsh and crowded place, where dozens of men worked feverishly along the riverbanks. Tents and shacks dotted the landscape, and the constant sound of picks and pans filled the air. Finding an unclaimed spot along the river proved to be a challenge, but Johann finally staked out a narrow stretch of muddy bank. With trembling hands, he dipped his pan into the icy water and began to swirl it, the sediment spinning away to reveal nothing. Undeterred, he tried again and again. Hours turned into days, and still his pan came up empty. But Johann refused to give up. Each night, he sat by his small fire, staring into the flames and thinking of his family back in Bavaria. He had promised to send for them once he struck it rich. Failure was not an option. As the days wore on, Johann began to learn the unspoken rules of the goldfields. Friendships were rare, and trust was rarer still. Arguments over claims often turned violent, and the threat of thieves loomed over every prospector. Johann kept to himself, working tirelessly from sunrise to sunset, the dream of gold his only companion. One evening, as he rested by the river, a grizzled old prospector approached him. The man introduced himself as Tom Harper, a veteran of the goldfields who had seen it all. "Don't kill yourself over these rocks, kid," Tom said, gesturing to Johann's pan. "This land's got a way of breaking a man before it makes him rich." Johann looked up, his determination unwavering. "I have to try," he said in halting English, "for my family." Tom nodded, a flicker of respect in his eyes. "Then let me show you something." That night, under a canopy of stars, Tom shared his knowledge of the land, how to read the river, how to spot promising gravel, and how to stay one step ahead of trouble. Johann listened intently, his resolve hardening. He knew his journey had only just begun. Under Tom Harper's mentorship, Johann Müller began to understand the art of prospecting. It wasn't just about dipping a pan into the water and hoping for the best. It required patience, observation, and a willingness to embrace the harsh realities of the goldfields. Days turned into weeks, and Johann's hands grew calloused from endless digging and sifting. His body ached, his clothes were tattered, but his determination never faltered. Tom, though gruff and weathered, became a valuable companion. He had a knack for finding promising spots and a wealth of stories about the goldfields, some humorous, others cautionary. Johann absorbed them all, slowly piecing together the complex world he had entered. "Gold doesn't come easy," Tom told him one afternoon as they rested by the river. "You think you're chasing fortune, but really, you're fighting this land. And this land doesn't like to lose." Johann nodded, his gaze fixed on the flowing water. "It's worth the fight," he said in his accented English. "For my family, for their future." Tom chuckled, shaking his head. "Kid, you've got more fire in you than most. Just don't let it burn you out." One morning, after a particularly long and fruitless week, Johann's luck began to change. Following Tom's advice, he had moved upstream to a secluded bend in the river. The spot didn't look like much. a shallow pool shaded by overhanging trees. But something about the way the gravel shimmered in the sunlight caught his attention. With renewed energy, Johann began working the spot. He scooped up a pan of sediment, swirling it carefully. The water sloshed over the edges, carrying away the lighter material, until only a small pile of black sand remained. And then, there it was, a glimmer of gold. Tiny flakes, barely larger than a grain of sand, but unmistakably gold. His heart raced as he leaned closer, his hands trembling. It wasn't much, but it was the first real sign that his efforts weren't in vain. He let out a triumphant shout, startling the birds from the trees. "Looks like you struck something," Tom said, appearing behind him with a grin. Johann held up the pan, his face beaming. "It's small, but it's real." Tom examined the pan and nodded. "It's a start, and sometimes that's all you need to keep going." Encouraged, Johann spent the next few days working the spot tirelessly. Each pan yielded more flakes, enough to fill a small vial. It wasn't the life-changing fortune he had dreamed of, but it was progress. For the first time since arriving in California, Johann felt like his goal was within reach. But the goldfields had a way of humbling even the most determined prospectors. As Johann's success grew, so did the risks. Word of his find spread among the other miners, and with it came jealousy and greed. One evening, as Johann returned to his camp, he found his supplies ransacked and his tools stolen. The vial of gold he had worked so hard to collect was gone. Fury and despair welled up inside him. He had been careful to keep his work quiet, but in the crowded and competitive goldfields, secrets were hard to keep. He clenched his fists, vowing not to let this setback break him. The next morning, Johann confronted Tom, who had become a trusted confidant. "They took everything," Johann said, his voice tight with anger. "All my work, gone." Tom sighed, lighting his pipe. "Welcome to the goldfields, kid. This place can bring out the worst in people." "What am I supposed to do?" Johann asked. "Start over? Trust no one?" Tom exhaled a cloud of smoke, his expression thoughtful. "You've got two choices. Give up or keep fighting. If you're smart, you'll learn from this. Work harder, but keep one eye open. This land might be harsh, but it doesn't owe anyone anything. The gold's out there. It's just a matter of whether you're tough enough to take it." Taking Tom's advice to heart, Johann rebuilt his camp and resumed his work, this time with a sharper sense of caution. He stashed his finds in hidden places, avoided sharing details about his progress, and kept his interactions with others to a minimum. It was a lonely existence, but it was necessary. Despite the challenges, Johann's determination began to pay off. Over the next few weeks, he uncovered a small but steady stream of gold, enough to fill several vials. It wasn't the fortune he had imagined, but it was enough to send back a modest sum to his family in Bavaria. He wrote them a letter, carefully packed the gold into a parcel, and entrusted it to a courier bound for San Francisco. That night, as Johann sat by his campfire, he allowed himself a rare moment of pride. He had faced betrayal, hardship, and disappointment, but he had persevered. The gold he had sent would help his family survive and perhaps even join him one day. For the first time since arriving in California, he felt a glimmer of hope. But Johann knew the fight wasn't over. The goldfields were unpredictable, and the stakes were always high. Yet, as he stared into the flames, he realized that his journey was about more than just wealth. It was about resilience, survival, and the unyielding belief that he could carve out a future for himself in this unforgiving land. The gold might be fickle, but Johann Müller was not. Weeks turned into months, and Johann Müller had transformed from a naive dreamer into a seasoned prospector. The once callow immigrant had gained the hardened look of someone who had faced the harsh realities of the goldfields and survived. His small claim along the secluded bend in the river had begun to yield steady returns, enough to keep him fed and send occasional parcels of gold back to his family in Bavaria. The work was relentless, the rewards modest, but Johann was proud of what he had built. Yet in the back of his mind, he knew the goldfields were as dangerous as they were promising. Every strike of his pickaxe reminded him of the risks: rival miners, shifting riverbeds, and the unpredictable forces of nature. And despite his best efforts to keep a low profile, Johann's growing success had not gone unnoticed. One evening, as Johann packed up his tools, he heard voices in the distance. He froze, his instincts sharpened by months of living on edge. Peering through the trees, he saw 3 men approaching his camp. They were rough-looking, their faces shadowed by wide-brimmed hats, their hands resting casually on the pistols at their belts. "Evening," the tallest of the men said, stepping into the light of Johann's campfire. His grin was as sharp as the knife strapped to his thigh. "Heard you've been making quite the haul out here." Johann's heart raced, but he forced himself to stay calm. "I don't know what you've heard," he said carefully, "but I've only found enough to get by." The man chuckled, glancing at his companions. "Now, that's a shame, because we were hoping you'd be willing to share a little of your luck with us." Johann gripped the handle of his pickaxe tightly. "I don't have anything worth taking." The grin disappeared from the man's face. "You see, that's where we disagree." Before Johann could respond, one of the other men lunged forward, grabbing him by the arm. Johann struggled, but the odds were against him. The men rifled through his belongings, tossing aside his tools and upending his carefully hidden stash of gold. The leader held up a small leather pouch, jingling its contents. "See? Told you he was holding out," the man said, his grin returning. Johann's anger flared. "That gold isn't yours," he shouted, wrenching free from his captor. He swung his pickaxe in a wide arc, forcing the men to step back. For a moment, the camp was silent except for the crackling of the fire. Then the leader's expression darkened. "Big mistake," he said, drawing his pistol. Just as the situation seemed hopeless, a gunshot rang out, but it didn't come from the leader. One of the men cried out and fell to the ground, and that clutching his leg. Johann turned to see Tom Harper stepping out of the shadows, a smoking rifle in his hands. "Drop it, boys," Tom growled, his voice low and commanding, "unless you want to leave here with more than just bruises." The remaining 2 men hesitated, but the sight of Tom's steady aim convinced them to back down. They hauled their injured companion to his feet and disappeared into the night, muttering curses under their breath. Tom lowered his rifle and stepped toward Johann, his expression stern. "You all right, kid?" Johann nodded, his chest heaving. "I didn't think they'd come for me so soon." "Greed doesn't wait," Tom said, glancing at the mess left behind. "But you handled yourself well. Proud of you." Johann felt a swell of gratitude, but also frustration. "They took everything I had." Tom clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Gold can be replaced. Your life can't." The attack was a wake-up call for Johann. The goldfields weren't just a test of skill and endurance. They were a fight for survival. Over the next few weeks, he doubled down on his efforts to secure his claim. He dug deeper into the riverbank, unearthing pockets of gold-rich gravel. He hid his finds in new, better-concealed locations and avoided talking to anyone outside of Tom. One crisp autumn morning, as Johann sifted through his latest haul, his pan revealed something extraordinary. Nestled among the black sand was a nugget of pure gold, larger than any he had ever seen. He stared at it in disbelief, his hands trembling as he picked it up. "Tom," he called, running toward his mentor's camp. "You won't believe this." Tom examined the nugget and let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be damned. That's enough to change your life, Johann. Maybe even get your family out here." Johann's mind raced with possibilities. This was the break he had been waiting for, the chance to bring his family to California and start a new life together. But as he looked at the nugget, he also felt the weight of what it represented. Gold had brought him hope, but it had also brought danger, betrayal, and loss. That evening, Johann and Tom shared a quiet moment by the fire. "What will you do now?" Tom asked, his voice soft. "I'll send for my family," Johann said. "But I think I'm done with the goldfields." Tom raised an eyebrow. "Done?" Johann nodded. "I came here for them, not for the gold. This place, it's taken enough from me. I want to give my family a better life, but I don't want it to cost me my soul." Tom smiled, his weathered face softening. "Smart choice, kid. Not many folks figure that out before it's too late." As the fire crackled and the stars shone overhead, Johann felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The goldfields had tested him in ways he never imagined, but they had also taught him what truly mattered. The next morning, Johann packed his belongings and said goodbye to the river that had been his home. With the nugget securely hidden, he began his journey back to San Francisco, where he would send for his family and start a new chapter. The promise of gold had brought him to California, but it was the promise of a future built on love and resilience that would guide him forward.